She gave him 3 years of her body, her trust, her father's name. He gave her silence in the dark and laughter behind closed doors. Vivian Mercer thought she'd married love. She'd actually married a thief wearing a wedding ring. The night rain hit the windows of her father's mansion. She heard the truth fall out of her husband's mouth like garbage spilling from a torn bag. She was never his wife, only his way inside the family fortune. If you're watching this story right now, hit like and drop the name of your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels tonight. The rain started a little after 9, and by midnight it had turned into something closer to an assault. Fat, relentless drops hammering the tall windows of the Mercer estate like something out there wanted in. Vivian stood at the top of the marble staircase in her socked feet, a glass of water sweating in her hand, listening to the storm argue with the glass. She was 31 years old. She had a closet full of dresses that cost more than some people's cars, a husband downstairs entertaining men with slicked back hair, and watches that ticked louder than their consciences, and a heart that, despite everything anyone in her family had ever taught her about armor, still beat soft and hopeful every single time Dominic Ravelli walked into a room. That was the joke of it. 3 years married to a man groomed in violence and ambition, and she still felt her stomach flip when he loosened his tie after a long day. She still left the porch light on when he worked late. She still believed, with the stupid, stubborn faith of a woman raised by wolves who'd decided to be gentle anyway, that somewhere under all that ruthless polish, Dominic loved her. She was wrong. She just didn't know it yet. Vivian Mercer was not a small woman, not in body, not in presence. She had her father's eyes, dark, assessing, the kind of eyes that made men in expensive suits straighten their spines without knowing why, and her mother's mouth, soft until provoked. She'd spent her whole life being looked at twice, once for her size and once for her name. Anthony Mercer's daughter. The heiress nobody quite knew what to do with because she didn't fit the mold of mafia royalty the tabloids wanted to sell. She wasn't thin. She wasn't decorative. She was smart and sharp-tongued when she let herself be, and for most of her 20s she'd been told, in 100 quiet ways, that smart and sharp-tongued were qualities a woman like her needed to apologize for. Dominic Ravelli had never once made her feel like she needed to apologize. That was what got her. That was the hook that sank in deep enough that she never felt the wound. He'd come up through her father's organization the hard way. Collections, then enforcement, then the kind of strategic violence that impressed men who valued strategy more than violence itself. He was 36, lean in the way of men who never stopped moving, with a jaw that looked carved and a laugh that came rarely enough to feel like a reward when it did. He had asked her to dance at her cousin's wedding 4 years ago, when she was standing near the bar trying to disappear into the wallpaper, and he hadn't looked at her like she was a consolation prize. He'd looked at her like she was the only woman in the room. She found out 2 years into the marriage that he'd told that exact same look to at least 3 other women. She just hadn't found out yet what he'd told the 4th. Tonight there was a party downstairs. Not a real party, more a working dinner dressed up in candlelight and 40-year-old scotch, the kind of gathering where men talked about shipping manifests and customs officials in the same breath they talked about football. Her father, Anthony Mercer, sat at the head of the table, even though his color had been bad for months, and the doctors had started using words like manage instead of cure. Dominic sat at his right hand. That seat used to be empty, reserved, sacred almost. Until 18 months ago, when Anthony, against the advice of nearly everyone who loved him, had started grooming his son-in-law to take the empire when he was gone. Vivian had wanted to believe that was a sign of trust. Now, standing at the top of the stairs with her glass sweating in her palm, she let herself wonder, for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, whether trust was the wrong word, whether what her father had actually handed Dominic was a leash with her name woven into the braid of it. She went down because she heard her name, not called, said, tossed around like something light enough to throw. She caught it through the gap of the study door, which someone had left open 3 inches, careless in the way men get careless when they think the house belongs only to them. Because the old man's clock is running out, that's why, Dominic was saying, and his voice had a register she didn't recognize, flat, amused, the voice of a man relaxing his face after holding a smile too long. Another 6 months, maybe less. The doctors aren't even pretending anymore. Another voice. Sal, her father's old accountant, a man who'd been at her christening, said something low she couldn't make out. She's not a problem, Dominic said, and there was a laugh folded into it, ugly and short, a laugh she had never once heard him use in front of her. She's never been a problem. Vivian does what Vivian does. She reads her books. She signs what I put in front of her. She waits up for me like a good girl. 3 years of being patient, Sal. 3 years of telling a woman the size of a small house that she's beautiful so she keeps believing the ring on her finger means something. A pause, the clink of ice against crystal. It bought me the whole empire. You think I wanted to marry that? You think I lie awake counting the ways I got lucky? The hallway tilted. Vivian would think about this moment for the rest of her life. Not the words themselves, though those would carve themselves into her like initials cut into a tree, but the strange clarity of the half-second after. The way the world didn't end. The chandelier above her didn't flicker. The rain didn't stop. Her heart, which she would have sworn was breaking, instead did something colder and more useful. It went quiet. It went still. The way an animal goes still right before it decides whether to run or whether to turn around and become the thing that's hunting you. She didn't make a sound. She'd spent her whole life being underestimated for being too soft to be dangerous. And in that one breath in the hallway, soaked in the sound of her husband's voice mocking the body she lived in and the love she'd given him for 3 years, she understood, with total and devastating precision, what her father had actually raised her to survive. She walked back up the stairs the way she'd come down, quiet, careful, every footstep deliberate. And she did not cry until she was behind her own bedroom door, with her back against the wood, and her hand pressed so hard against her own mouth that her jaw ached the next morning. She let herself have exactly 11 minutes of grief. She counted them on the small clock on her nightstand, the one her father had given her when she turned 18, brass and ticking and older than her marriage by decades. 11 minutes of silent, shaking, furious crying, the kind that comes from somewhere underneath the ribs. And then she stood up, washed her face in cold water until the redness in her eyes looked more like exhaustion than heartbreak, and went to find her father. Anthony Mercer was in his private office on the second floor, away from the dinner noise, sitting in the leather chair that had outlived 2 of his marriages and most of his friends. He looked smaller than he used to. Cancer does that to a man who built his whole identity on taking up space. But his eyes were still the eyes that had run half the East Coast shipping lanes for 30 years, sharp even now, even sick. "You look like you've been crying," he said, not looking up from the papers in his lap. "I'm fine." "You're a Mercer. We don't do fine, we do controlled." He finally looked at her, and something in his face changed when he saw hers. Not surprise, she would realize later. Recognition. "What did he say to you?" She almost lied. Some old habit of protecting the peace of a room, of smoothing things over so nobody had to feel the discomfort of her pain. But she was done with that particular inheritance. "Not to me," she said. "About me. To Sal. In the study." Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that later, the way you're proud of a wound that healed clean. "He called me a shield, Dad. Said marrying me bought him the empire. Said he tells me I'm beautiful, so I'll keep believing it." Her father was quiet for a long time. Outside, the rain had not let up. It hammered the window behind him like something trying to break in, or maybe trying to warn them about something already inside. "I know," he finally said. 2 words. They landed harder than anything Dominic had said downstairs. "You know, I've known for a year," Anthony said, and his voice had gone somewhere old and tired, somewhere that sounded, for the first time in Vivian's life, like an apology. "I'm dying, Viv. I needed someone hungry enough to hold the commission together when I'm gone, and Dominic is hungry. I thought—" He stopped, pressed 2 fingers against his eyes. "I thought if he had you, he'd have a reason to be loyal. I thought love would grow into the marriage, even if it didn't start there. I was wrong. I'm sorry. I built you a cage and called it a wedding, and I am sorry." Vivian sat down across from him, the same chair she'd sat in as a teenager, waiting to be told she was in trouble. Her hands were steady. That surprised her more than the apology did. "Then tell me how to get out of it." Her father studied her for a long moment, and something shifted behind his eyes. Pride, maybe, or relief, or the particular satisfaction of a man realizing the daughter he'd underestimated his entire life had been listening all along far more carefully than he knew. "You don't get out of it," he said slowly. "You take it, all of it, everything he thinks he married into." He leaned forward, and despite the gray in his face, despite the tremor that had started living permanently in his left hand, his voice came out hard as the floor of a vault. "Dominic thinks the empire is ledgers and warehouses and men with guns. That's the part he's allowed to see. The real fortune, the offshore accounts, the shell networks, the assets that actually keep this family untouchable, none of that exists on paper he's ever read. It exists in 4 places, and only one person besides me has the keys to all 4. Me," Vivian said. "You," her father confirmed. "I made sure of it 8 years ago, before you ever brought that man home. Before I had any idea what kind of mistake I was about to help you make. Every signature, every access code, every relationship with every banker in Zurich and Geneva and the Caymans. It runs through you, Vivian, not him. He could burn this house down with him still standing in the rubble, and he wouldn't touch a cent of what actually matters." She felt something in her chest that she hadn't expected. Not vindication, not yet. Something quieter and more dangerous. Possibility. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I wanted you to live a life that wasn't all teeth," her father said, and for one unguarded second he looked like exactly what he was. A dying man who had failed his daughter in the specific surgical way that only fathers who love too cautiously manage to fail their children. "I wanted you to have a marriage that felt like rest instead of war. I see now that was never going to be available to you. Not married to him, maybe not married to anyone in this life." He reached out and took her hand, and his grip, weakened as it was, still carried the old authority she remembered from childhood. "I'm not going to be here much longer, Vivian. 6 months, the doctors say, and doctors are usually optimistic with men like me. When I'm gone, he is going to move fast. He's going to assume the throne is his because he's wearing the right suit and sitting in the right chair. I need you to let him believe that, right up until the moment it's no longer true." Vivian sat with that for a long time, listening to the rain, feeling something in her settle into place like a key finding the right lock after years of trying every wrong one in the house. "I want to know everything," she said. "Tonight. All 4 accounts. Every code. Every name." Her father almost smiled. It was the closest thing to pride she'd ever seen on his face. "That's my girl," he said. "It took 6 hours. They sat in that office until the sky outside started to gray at the edges, going through ledgers her father had kept hidden in a false panel behind his desk. Networks of accounts spread across countries whose names she'd only ever seen on luxury travel brochures. Relationships with bankers and lawyers, and one terrifyingly competent woman in Geneva named Mafia Boss, who, her father assured her, would burn the entire Swiss banking system to the ground before she let a single unauthorized signature touch Anthony Mercer's accounts. By the time the sun came up, Vivian Mercer was a different woman than the one who'd gone to bed the night before believing she was loved. She didn't sleep. She showered, dressed, and went down to breakfast and sat across from her husband while he ate eggs and talked about a shipment delay like it was the only thing happening in either of their lives. And she smiled at him the way she'd smiled at him for 3 years. And inside her chest, something had gone cold and clear and patient as glass. "You're quiet this morning," Dominic said, not really looking up from his phone. "Didn't sleep well," she said. "Storm kept me up." "Yeah." He still didn't look at her. "Me neither. Long night with Sal." She watched him say it, watched the casual, easy lie slide out of his mouth like it cost him nothing, like the woman across the table from him was furniture he'd long since stopped seeing, and she felt, for the first time since the hallway, something other than grief. She felt curious, the way a person feels curious watching a storm roll in from a safe distance, knowing exactly how much damage it's capable of, knowing exactly how long they have before it arrives. The weeks that followed were a study in performance. Vivian had never thought of herself as someone good at deception. She'd built her whole identity around being too honest, too soft, too easily read. It turned out that softness, properly aimed, was its own kind of armor. She kept up every habit that had defined her marriage. She waited up for Dominic on the nights he came home late, smelling like someone else's perfume, and she made herself ask, gently, where he'd been. And she made herself believe, performed believing whatever answer he gave her. She still left the porch light on. She still signed whatever documents he slid in front of her at the kitchen table, scanning them quickly enough to look distracted, carefully enough to understand exactly what he was building and exactly how little of it actually touched the accounts that mattered. She watched him with her father, too, watched the careful, practiced deference Dominic showed Anthony in public, and the barely concealed impatience that flickered through when he thought no one was paying attention, the way his jaw tightened when Anthony took too long to finish a sentence, the way his eyes did the math on how much longer he'd have to wait. She'd never seen it before. She wondered, with a kind of dull horror, how much else she'd never let herself see. There was a model. Of course there was a model. Dominic wasn't subtle once you knew to look. He was simply confident, which was its own kind of camouflage. Her name was Celine Marchetti, 26 years old, the kind of beautiful that stopped conversations and started rumors. And she appeared often enough in the society pages on Dominic's arm at events Vivian wasn't invited to that even the gossip columns had started, delicately, to ask questions. Vivian found the first photo on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the hallway, scrolling through a society blog with the same detached curiosity she'd bring to reading about a stranger's divorce. Dominic at a gallery opening, his hand low on Celine's back, an expression on his face that Vivian hadn't seen directed at her in over a year. She closed the laptop. She did not cry. She had used up her allotted grief in 11 minutes on a different night, and what she felt now was something closer to confirmation than pain, the grim, settling satisfaction of watching a theory prove itself true. She started keeping a list, not of grievances. She'd given up on grievances the moment she understood the marriage had never been real enough to be grieved properly. A list of dates, where Dominic claimed to be, where the photographs placed him, the small forensic accounting of a marriage built on lies, compiled with the same cold precision she was learning to apply to everything else in her life. She didn't know yet exactly what she'd do with it. She only knew that information, in this family, was the only currency that had ever mattered, and she intended to be rich in it by the time she needed to spend it. Anthony Mercer's health declined faster than the doctors predicted, the way these things sometimes do when a man finally stops fighting the diagnosis and starts making arrangements instead. By late autumn, he was confined mostly to the house, then mostly to his room, then mostly to the bed in that room, a withering that Vivian watched with the particular grief of a daughter losing the only parent who had ever truly seen her. Flawed, complicated, guilty of his own failures, but hers. Dominic's behavior changed as Anthony's body failed. He grew bolder in small ways, taking meetings without informing anyone, redirecting shipments without consulting the accountants, speaking to the other capos in the commission with a confidence that belonged to a man already wearing a crown nobody had handed him yet. Vivian watched it happen the way you watch weather building on a horizon, recognizing the shape of the thing coming even before it arrives. 2 weeks before her father died, he called her into his room in the middle of the night. The nurse had been sent away. The lamp on the nightstand threw long shadows across a face that had gone thin and gray, but his eyes, when they found hers, were as sharp as they'd ever been. "He's going to move within days of the funeral," Anthony said, his voice a rasp now, every word costing him something. "Maybe hours. He won't wait out of respect. Respect was never the currency he was trading in." "I know. You have everything you need, the accounts, the codes, Margaret's number?" "I have everything." Her father reached for her hand. His grip had grown so weak it barely registered as pressure, but the intention behind it was enormous. A whole lifetime of love and failure and stubborn, complicated pride compressed into the last strength he had left. "I should have protected you better," he said. "I should have seen what kind of man I was handing you to. I told myself it was strategy. It was cowardice wearing a strategist's clothes." His eyes were wet, and Vivian realized, with a lurch in her chest, that she had never once in her entire life seen her father cry. "Promise me something. Anything." "Don't let him make you small," Anthony whispered. "Don't let him make you disappear into the shape he decided you should be. You are not a shield, Vivian. You never were. You are the whole damn empire walking around in a body he was too stupid to understand the value of. When I'm gone, take it back. Take all of it. Not for revenge. For yourself. Promise me that's the difference you'll remember." She promised. She held his hand until the lamp burned low, and the rasp of his breathing evened out into something like sleep, and she sat in the dark of that room, turning his words over like stones in her palm, feeling the weight of them settle into the foundation of whoever she was about to become. Anthony Mercer died 11 days later, on a gray Thursday morning, quietly, with Vivian holding one hand and a priestless silence filling the room. No last rites requested, no clergy summoned, just a daughter and the slow stopping of a heart that had run an empire for 3 decades and in its final months had finally tried to do right by the one person it had failed the most. The funeral was enormous. The kind of funeral that shuts down city blocks and fills the front pews with men whose names appeared in federal indictments they'd somehow always managed to avoid being convicted under. Dominic stood at Vivian's side throughout, his hand at the small of her back, his face arranged into perfect, photogenic grief, accepting condolences meant for her like a man accepting compliments on a house he didn't build. She let him. She stood beside him in black, her face composed into the appropriate architecture of mourning, and underneath all of it, in the place where her grief actually lived, separate now from anything Dominic was allowed to see, she watched him work the room. Watched him shake hands with the capos of the commission with the particular warmth of a man auditioning for a job he'd already decided was his. Watched him glance, more than once, toward the back of the church where Selene Marchetti sat in oversized sunglasses, present at her husband's father-in-law's funeral with a brazenness that would have wounded her 3 months ago and now simply confirmed once more the shape of the thing she already knew. That night, after the wake had emptied out and the house had gone quiet, Dominic found her in her father's study. Her study now, technically, though he didn't seem to register the shift in ownership yet. "Big day tomorrow," he said, pouring himself a drink from her father's good scotch, the one nobody touched without permission, except apparently him now. "Commission's calling a formal session. They're going to want to talk succession." "I know," Vivian said, watching him from the chair her father had died believing he'd failed her in. "It's going to be me," Dominic said, and there was something in his voice, not a question, never a question, the flat confidence of a man who had never once seriously entertained the alternative. "I've earned it. 3 years building relationships, 3 years proving I can run this thing better than half the old guard ever could." "I know," Vivian said again. He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he used to look at her in the early days, before the contempt had crept in and made a home behind his eyes. For one unsettling second, she thought he might actually see her. The new her, the one who'd been built in the wreckage of a hallway eavesdrop, and 6 hours of ledgers and her father's dying instructions. But the moment passed. He smiled instead, easy and warm and completely, devastatingly false. "You've been good through all this," he said. "Quiet, supportive. I won't forget it, Viv. When this is mine, you'll always have a place." A place. As if she were furniture being granted a permanent spot in a house. As if 3 years and a hidden empire's worth of access codes amounted, in his accounting, to a seat near the door. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came out exactly as soft and grateful as he expected it to. And underneath the words, in the part of her he'd spent 3 years training himself not to look at, something locked into place with the quiet, final click of a door sealing shut. The commission session happened the next afternoon, in a private room above a restaurant in Little Italy that had hosted exactly this kind of meeting for 2 generations of Mercer business. Vivian wasn't invited to sit at the table. Women never were, not formally, a rule so old none of the men in that room had ever questioned it out loud. But she stood in the doorway in respectful silence while 6 capos and Dominic Ravelli discussed. With the particular delicacy men use when discussing power, they're afraid to seem too eager for. Who would inherit Anthony Mercer's seat at the head of the East Coast shipping operations? Dominic made his case well. He'd clearly rehearsed it. 3 years of loyalty, 3 years of operational improvements, the marriage that bound him, in theory, to the Mercer bloodline itself. He spoke about respect for Anthony's legacy, about continuity, about strength in uncertain times. The older men around the table nodded along, some out of genuine respect, some out of the simple math of self-preservation that says it's easier to back the man already standing closest to the throne than to start a war over who deserves it. By the end of the session, it was settled, at least in the room's collective understanding. Dominic Ravelli would assume operational control of the Mercer organization. The transition would be formalized within the month. Men shook hands, drinks were poured, Someone made a toast to Anthony Mercer's memory, and Dominic accepted the moment like a crown being lowered onto his head, his face arranged into the perfect blend of humility and ambition that men in rooms like that one learn to perform before they learn almost anything else. Vivienne stood in his doorway and watched her husband inherit an empire built entirely on a fortune he would never be able to touch. That night, she packed one suitcase. She didn't take jewelry. She didn't take the dresses that had cost more than cars, didn't take a single thing from the closet that had defined 3 years of her curated, performed life as Mrs. Dominic Ravelli. She took documents, copies, carefully made over the preceding months and stolen moments, while Dominic was out with Celine or out building the relationships he thought would secure his throne. She took a burner phone with exactly one contact saved in it, a number belonging to Marcus Boone, her father's longtime head of security, a man who had watched her grow up and who had come to her 3 days after the funeral in the quiet hours of the morning with an offer that had nothing to do with loyalty to Dominic and everything to do with loyalty to a dead man who'd asked him, with some of his last clear breaths, to keep his daughter safe from whatever was coming. "He doesn't know what's in those accounts," Marcus had told her, his voice low, his eyes scanning the room the way they always did, even in a house he'd worked in for 15 years. "He doesn't know what you know. He thinks the empire is what's on paper in his office. Your father made sure of it." He'd paused, studying her face with the careful attention of a man assessing whether someone was ready for what came next. "Whenever you're ready to leave, I can get you out clean. No trace. Somewhere he can't reach you, can't pressure you, can't talk his way back into your good graces, because that's the only weapon he's ever really had over you. Shit. And if I'm not ready, then you're not ready," Marcus had said simply. "But your father didn't raise a woman who waits forever to be ready. He raised one who waits exactly long enough." 3 weeks after the commission session, Vivienne decided she'd waited exactly long enough. She left in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, the house still dark, Dominic asleep upstairs after a late night she hadn't bothered asking him to account for. She moved through the house she'd lived in for 3 years with the quiet, careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime being underestimated and intended, for the first time, to use that underestimation as a weapon instead of a wound. She left her wedding ring on the kitchen table, the same table where she'd signed away 3 years of careless trust on documents he'd never once explained to her. Beside it, she left a single folded note, 4 sentences long, written in her own steady hand. "Check the family accounts, Dominic. All of them. You'll understand soon enough what you actually married and what you never once managed to own." She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. Marcus was waiting outside in a car with plates that would mean nothing to anyone who ran them, the engine already warm, the city still dark and wet from a rain that had finally stopped, sometime after midnight. Vivienne climbed into the back seat with her one suitcase and the burner phone, and 3 years' worth of carefully documented humiliation transformed, finally, fully, into resolve. "Switzerland," she said, before he could ask. "Margit Voss is expecting us. My father set it up months ago, in case it ever came to this." Marcus pulled away from the curb without a word, and Vivienne Mercer watched the house she'd called home disappear in the rearview mirror, dark and silent, and utterly unaware of what was about to detonate inside it. She didn't look back again. She'd spent 3 years looking backward, looking for the man she'd married in the eyes of the man who'd actually been standing there the whole time, mocking her in rooms she wasn't supposed to hear. She was done looking backward. Somewhere over the Atlantic, 8 hours later, while Vivienne slept fitfully in a private cabin Marcus had arranged with the kind of efficiency that comes from decades of moving important things quietly, Dominic Ravelli woke up in an empty bed in a house that had gone suddenly, suspiciously silent, and found a wedding ring and 4 sentences waiting for him on the kitchen table, like the first shot fired in a war he didn't yet know had started. By the time he understood what those 4 sentences meant, by the time he picked up the phone and called the bank that handled the organization's primary accounts, only to be told, with the bland, bureaucratic indifference of someone reading from a script, that the accounts in question had been restructured and were no longer accessible under his existing authorization, the woman he'd spent 3 years calling a shield was already 6,000 miles away, sitting in a glass-walled office overlooking Lake Geneva, signing the first of what would become a long, patient, devastating series of decisions designed to take back, piece by piece, dollar by dollar, everything that had ever belonged to her. Dominic Ravelli stood in the kitchen with a phone pressed so hard against his ear that the plastic creaked, and the bank representative on the other end kept using the word restructured, like it was a perfectly normal thing to say to a man whose entire morning had just collapsed under him. "What do you mean restructured?" he said. His voice came out flatter than he wanted it to. "I'm the operational head of this organization. I need access to the primary accounts. Today. Now." "Sir, I understand your frustration, but the authorization on file was updated 11 days ago. I'm not able to disclose. 11 days ago, I buried my father-in-law. Who updated what? I'm not able to disclose account holder information to anyone outside the listed authorization, sir." He hung up. He stood there in his undershirt, barefoot on the cold tile, staring at the wedding ring sitting on the table like a dead thing, like roadkill somebody had left for him to find. And underneath the ring, 4 sentences in handwriting he'd watched sign 100 documents without ever once reading what she actually understood about them. "Check the family accounts, Dominic. All of them. You'll understand soon enough what you actually married and what you never once managed to own." He read it 3 times. The first time his jaw just tightened. The second time his hand started shaking, just slightly, just enough that the paper made a small dry sound against the table. The third time he balled it up and threw it across the kitchen, and it hit the refrigerator and bounced off and rolled under a chair like something embarrassed of itself. "Sal," he said into the phone 2 minutes later, his voice low and dangerous in a way that made even the dog in the corner lift its head. "Get over here. Now. And get me Marcus Boone's number." "Marcus isn't answering," Sal said 20 minutes later, standing in that same kitchen in yesterday's clothes, looking like a man who hadn't slept and didn't expect to anytime soon. "His phone's dead. Or off. Or he's with her," Dominic said. "With who?" Dominic didn't answer. He was staring at his own reflection in the dark window over the sink, at a man who, 12 hours ago, believed he had inherited the most profitable shipping and logistics empire on the East Coast, and who now understood, with the particular cold clarity that comes right before fury, that he had inherited a name and a title and absolutely nothing underneath either one. "Call the lawyers," he said. "All of them. I want every account, every holding company, every shell, every property deed pulled and on this table by tonight." "It's already happening," Sal said carefully. "That's the thing, Dom. It's not happening. Half the holding companies, they're not responding to inquiries. The law firm in Geneva that handled the offshore stuff, they're saying they can't confirm or deny client relationships. The domestic accounts are frozen pending. Pending what? Nobody will say. It's like somebody pulled a plug somewhere and the whole grid just went dark." "Somebody didn't pull the plug, Sal." Dominic turned from the window, and his eyes had gone somewhere Sal had only seen twice before in 15 years of working with him, both times right before something happened to somebody who'd made a serious mistake. Somebody planned this. For months. Maybe years. "Who?" Dominic didn't say her name. He didn't need to. He picked up the crumpled note from where it had rolled under the chair, smoothed it flat against the table with the heel of his hand, and read it one more time. And this time his face didn't tighten with anger. It went still. Blank. The particular blankness of a man recalculating every assumption he'd built his entire adult life on top of. "Get me everything we have on our father's accounts," he said quietly. "Everything. Old ledgers, old contacts, anyone who ever worked the books for Anthony Mercer going back 20 years. I want to know who Anthony trusted with money he didn't trust me with." Sal hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely a beat, but Dominic caught it the way he caught everything that mattered. "What?" "There were always rumors," Sal said slowly, "that the old man kept a second set of books, that the real money, the stuff that mattered, never touched anything you or I ever saw. I always figured it was just talk, mob legend. Every crime family's got a story like that. And you're telling me now." "I'm telling you now because 4 hours ago it was talk, Dom, and now it's looking like the only thing in this whole mess that actually makes sense." The first 3 days were chaos dressed up as control. Dominic moved through the organization like a man putting out fires with his bare hands, smiling at the capos who called wanting reassurance, snapping at the lawyers who couldn't produce answers fast enough, drinking more than he wanted anyone to notice and noticing with a slow building dread that people were starting to notice anyway. The warehouses kept running because the warehouses didn't need bank approval to keep loading containers. The street-level operations kept moving because cash still moved the way cash always moved, hand to hand, low to the ground, beneath the reach of whatever had frozen everything above it. But the real engine of the Mercer Empire, the shipping contracts that required massive lines of credit, the customs relationships that required quarterly payments routed through entities Dominic had never personally touched, the insurance policies on a fleet of cargo vessels worth more than some small countries, all of it ran on infrastructure that lived somewhere he couldn't see, controlled by someone who had apparently decided, 11 days after her father's funeral, to simply stop letting him see it. On the fourth day, the first vessel got turned away from port in Rotterdam over an insurance lapse nobody had flagged. On the fifth day, a customs broker in Long Beach who'd worked with the Mercer organization for 9 years called to say, with genuine confusion in his voice, that the line of credit backing their shipments had been closed. And did Mr. Ravelli have updated payment information? Because otherwise, they'd need to hold the next 3 containers at the dock. How does a line of credit just close? Dominic said, standing in his office. Her father's office, technically, though he'd already started thinking of it as his, with the phone against his ear and a vein working in his temple. I don't know, Mr. Ravelli. I just process what the bank sends me. The closure notice came through 8 days ago. Somebody on your end should have... Somebody on my end didn't do this. He hung up before the man finished his sentence and stood there breathing hard, his hands flat on the desk, staring at a framed photograph Anthony Mercer had kept on the credenza for 30 years, a black and white shot of the old man young and lean on a Brooklyn dock, standing next to the first cargo vessel he'd ever owned outright. He thought about Vivian's face. Not the face he'd been performing affection at for 3 years, not the soft, grateful expression she wore when he handed her documents to sign. He thought about the face she'd had at breakfast the morning after he'd told Sal she did what she did. The morning he'd told a casual lie about a long night, and she'd said nothing, asked nothing, simply nodded and let it slide past her like water past a rock. He remembered thinking, in some unexamined corner of his mind, that her quietness that morning had meant nothing. Habit. The dull complacency of a wife who'd stopped really looking at him years ago. He understood now, standing in an office that smelled like his father-in-law's cigars, that her quietness that morning had meant something very specific. It had meant she already knew exactly what he'd said in that study, exactly what he thought of her, exactly what kind of man he actually was underneath 3 years of performance. And she had decided in that exact moment to let him keep believing the performance was working. The thought made something cold move through his chest that he didn't have a name for. It wasn't quite fear. It was closer to the feeling of realizing you'd been playing chess against someone who'd already seen 6 moves past where you thought the game ended. Celine called him that week, twice, both times asking about a trip to Capri she'd been planning around, both times sounding faintly irritated when he told her he couldn't talk about it right now. He was dealing with something at work. She didn't ask what. She never asked what. That had been part of her appeal in the early days. A woman who wanted his attention and his money and absolutely nothing of the complicated weight underneath either one. Now, listening to her voice go thin and impatient on the phone, while his entire empire dissolved around him, he found himself wondering, with an unwelcome flicker of clarity, whether that particular quality made her appealing or simply made her exactly as hollow as everyone who actually knew her had always said. He didn't call her back the second time. He told himself it was because he was busy. By the second week, the commission started to notice. It happened the way these things always happen in that world, not through formal accusation, but through small absences. Frank Calabrese, the oldest capo on the commission and the man whose support had been the deciding vote in handing Dominic the empire, stopped returning calls within 48 hours. Then a meeting Dominic had scheduled with 3 of the other capos to discuss a joint shipping venture got quietly rescheduled, then rescheduled again, then simply stopped being mentioned at all. He ran into one of them, Tommy Greco, a heavy-set man with a face like a bulldog who'd known Dominic since his collections days, at a restaurant in the Bronx, and Tommy's handshake was a half-second too brief, his eyes sliding away a half-second too fast. "Everything good, Tommy?" "Everything's good, Dom." Tommy's smile didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Just hearing things, you know. Things about the books being a little tangled up since the old man passed. Nothing serious, I'm sure." "Nothing serious," Dominic repeated. That's right. Tommy clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that should have felt friendly and instead felt, in the moment, like a man checking for a weapon. You let us know if you need anything straightened out. Family looks after family. He walked away before Dominic could answer, and Dominic stood there in the restaurant entrance with his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached, understanding for the first time exactly how fast loyalty could evaporate in that world. The second the money supporting it showed the first crack. That night he came home. To the house. The same house, still technically his because nobody had bothered to take that from him yet, though he was starting to wonder how long that particular oversight would last. And he sat alone in the study where it had all started, where he'd told Sal 3 years of patience had bought him an empire. And he poured himself a drink from a bottle that was almost empty now, far emptier than it had any right to be after only 2 weeks. He thought about calling her. He actually picked up his phone and scrolled to her name, the contact still saved under Viv from some earlier performative version of their relationship that he'd never bothered to update, and his thumb hovered over the call button for almost a full minute before he set the phone down without dialing. What would he even say? Apologize? For what, specifically? For the truth of what he'd said in that study, or simply for the fact that she'd heard it? He turned the question over and found, with a discomfort he didn't examine too closely, that he wasn't entirely sure there was a difference. He had meant every word he'd said to Sal that night. The marriage had been strategy. She had been a door he walked through to get somewhere better. He'd told himself for 3 years that the affection he showed her wasn't a lie exactly, just a kindness, a generosity extended to a woman who needed it more than most. And sitting there now, watching his entire inheritance dissolve in real time because of decisions she'd apparently been making in absolute silence for longer than he could trace. He understood, with a flash of something close to respect that disgusted him even as he felt it, that he had badly, catastrophically underestimated exactly how much that woman had been paying attention. He drank until the bottle was empty and the study had gone dark around him, and somewhere in that darkness, a thought surfaced that he didn't like and couldn't put back down. He had spent 3 years certain she was the slow one in the marriage, the soft one, the one who needed managing, reassuring, gently steered, and the entire time she had been 3 steps ahead of him, learning everything he didn't know he was teaching her, and the day he'd finally relaxed enough to stop performing, she had simply, quietly, walked out the door with everything that mattered and left him a wedding ring as a receipt. In Geneva, Vivienne sat across a glass conference table from Margit Voss, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back tight and a voice that carried the precise, unhurried authority of someone who had spent 3 decades making sure other people's secrets stayed secret. "Your father called me 11 months ago," Margit said, sliding a folder across the table. "He told me the day might come when you would need to take control faster than either of you expected. He was not specific about why. I think, now, looking at the timeline, he understood his own mortality more clearly than he let anyone believe." "He knew about Dominic," Vivienne said, "or suspected, long before I did. Fathers often know more than they say, Mrs. Mercer." Margit paused, then offered the smallest, most deliberate correction. "Mercer, not Ravelli. The accounts have already been adjusted to reflect that. I assumed, given the circumstances, you would prefer it that way." Vivienne felt something in her chest unclench at the sound of her own name, restored, separated from a man who'd worn it like a costume for 3 years. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. There's considerably more work ahead of you than there was behind you." Margit opened the folder and turned it so Vivienne could see the spreadsheet inside. Rows and columns of holding companies, shell entities, lines of credit, insurance policies, and at the bottom, in red, a running total that made even Vivienne, who had spent the last month learning to absorb numbers like this without flinching, go quiet for a moment. "This is what he's been operating on," Margit said, tapping the page. "Every shipment, every contract, every relationship that keeps the visible side of the business running. It all depends on credit lines and insurance policies that exist on paper your father controlled, and that you, as of 11 days ago, now control instead. Mr. Ravelli does not yet understand the difference between owning an empire and being permitted to operate one. I suspect he is beginning to learn." "How long before it really hurts him?" Margit's smile was thin, professional, and entirely without warmth. "It is already hurting him. The question is only how long before it becomes public enough that the people around him start to feel it too." In my experience, that timeline accelerates considerably once the first shipment misses a deadline. It had already happened. Vivian knew because she'd built a small, quiet network of her own in the weeks before she left. Not spies exactly, just people who owed her father favors and were willing, for reasons of loyalty or money or both, to keep her informed. She knew about Rotterdam. She knew about Long Beach. She knew, with a satisfaction she examined honestly and found she did not feel guilty about, that Dominic had spent the last several nights drinking alone in a study that no longer belonged to him in any way that mattered. "I want to move faster," she told Margit, "not just freezing what he can't access. I want to actively dismantle what he thinks he controls. The businesses, the contracts, the relationships he built his reputation on, while my father groomed him for a throne he never actually held the keys to." Margit studied her for a long moment, the particular assessment of a woman deciding whether the person across the table understood the weight of what they were asking for. "That is a significant escalation, Mrs. Mercer. Freezing accounts is defense. What you're describing is offense. Once you begin actively liquidating his holdings, redirecting his contracts, calling in debts you control through shell entities he doesn't know you own, there will be no path back to quiet separation. He will know, eventually, that this is deliberate, that it is you. Men like Dominic Ravelli do not absorb that kind of humiliation gracefully." "I'm not interested in quiet separation," Vivian said, and her voice, when it came out, surprised even her with how level it was, how entirely without tremor. "He told another man I was a shield he bought with 3 years of pretending to love me. He's been photographed with his mistress at events I wasn't invited to, while I sat at home signing whatever he put in front of me like a good, grateful wife. My father spent the last 6 months of his life apologizing to me for the mistake of handing this man a seat at the table. I'm not interested in being careful with someone who was never careful with me." Margit closed the folder slowly. "Then we begin in the morning," she said. "I will need 3 weeks to properly structure the liquidations so they cannot be easily traced back to a single source. After that," she allowed herself the smallest, coldest smile Vivian had seen from her yet, "Mr. Ravelli is going to have a very difficult year." The 3 weeks moved like a held breath. Vivian worked 16-hour days in the glass office overlooking the lake, learning the architecture of an empire she'd spent her whole adult life adjacent to and never once truly understood. She learned which shell companies controlled which port relationships, which insurance underwriters had quietly extended credit to the Mercer organization, on terms that existed only because of her father's personal guarantee. A guarantee that, with his death, technically required renegotiation that only she, as controller of the underlying accounts, had the authority to approve or deny. She denied almost everything, methodically, patiently. Not all at once. Margit was firm about that, the slow bleed being far harder to trace and far more devastating in its cumulative effect than a single dramatic strike. But steadily, week after week, contract after contract, until the visible Mercer organization that Dominic Ravelli believed he commanded began to feel, from the inside, like a building with its support beams quietly removed one at a time, while the people living in it kept insisting everything was fine. She thought about him less than she expected to. That surprised her, some nights, lying awake in the unfamiliar quiet of a Swiss apartment that didn't creak the way the New York house had creaked, that didn't carry 3 years of half-remembered tenderness in its walls. She'd expected grief to follow her across the ocean. Instead, what followed her was something stranger, a kind of grim, focused clarity, the sensation of a woman who had spent her entire life being told what she was allowed to want, and had finally, devastatingly, stopped asking permission. She thought about her father more, about the apology he'd given her in that office with the rain hammering the windows, about the look on his face in those last weeks when he'd finally, fully seen her, not as a daughter to be protected from the family business, but as the only person strong enough, smart enough, patient enough to actually inherit it. She found, in the quiet hours before sleep, that she missed him in a way that had almost nothing to do with comfort and almost everything to do with witness. She wished, more than anything else, that he could see what she was building in the wreckage of what he'd left behind. Back in New York, Dominic's unraveling accelerated past anything even he had braced for. The commission called a session he wasn't invited to attend, a fact relayed to him secondhand 2 days after it happened by a nervous junior capo who clearly hadn't wanted to be the one delivering the news. Frank Calabrese, the old man whose vote had put Dominic in power, had apparently spent the session asking pointed questions about the organization's financial stability. Questions nobody at the table had been able to answer with any confidence. "They're talking about a vote of confidence," the junior capo told him, sweating despite the cold in the room. Not against you exactly, just checking, making sure the organization's solid before they keep backing it publicly." "And what did Frank say?" "Frank said—" The man hesitated, and Dominic felt his hands curl into fists before he'd consciously decided to make fists. "Frank said the old man would have never let things get this loose, that maybe the wrong person ended up holding the reins." Dominic didn't remember deciding to throw the lamp across the room. He remembered the sound of it shattering against the wall, and the junior capo flinching backward like a man who'd just learned something important about his own life expectancy, and the long, ringing silence afterward in which Dominic stood breathing hard in the middle of a room full of broken glass, understanding, with total and humiliating clarity, that the empire he'd spent 3 years building toward was being dismantled by someone he could not find, could not confront, could not even properly blame in a room full of men who would respect the blame. He tried calling Vivian's old number that night. Disconnected. He tried the law firm that had handled their wedding prenup, on the thin theory that maybe there was some procedural angle, some legal lever he could pull to force a conversation, force an accounting, force her back into a room where he could look her in the eye and figure out exactly how much she knew and exactly how he could talk his way around it. The lawyer on the other end, a man who'd billed the Mercer family for 2 decades, told him, with careful professional regret, that Mrs. Mercer's current representation was a Geneva-based firm that did not accept inquiries from opposing parties without formal legal process, and that given the complexity of the marital and business assets involved, Mr. Ravelli might want to consider retaining separate counsel of his own. Opposing parties. The phrase landed in Dominic's chest like a verdict already rendered. He started drinking earlier in the day after that. He told himself it was to manage stress, the same way he told himself the meeting cancellations were scheduling conflicts, and the capo's averted eyes were nothing personal, and the missed shipments were just bad luck compounding on bad luck. He was a man rapidly losing the ability to tell himself convincing lies, which was, in its own bitter way, the first honest thing happening to him in years. Celine left a month into the unraveling. Not dramatically. She didn't make a scene, didn't slam a door, simply stopped returning calls with the same quiet, gradual disappearing act that Vivian had once perfected, and Dominic had never once recognized as a warning sign, because he'd never imagined a woman walking away from him without first making sure he understood exactly how much it would hurt. He found out 3 weeks later, through a gossip item online, that she was now seeing a Saudi shipping magnate 20 years older than him, with a net worth that made the entire Mercer organization look, in its current depleted state, like a rounding error. He read the item twice, standing alone in a kitchen that had once held a wedding ring and a 4-sentence death warrant, and he laughed, a short, ugly, humorless sound that startled even him, the laugh of a man recognizing, far too late, the particular comedy of his own arrogance. He had built a life on the theory that women were interchangeable instruments, useful for what they provided, disposable once they stopped providing it, never dangerous in their own right, because he had never once seriously entertained the possibility that danger could wear a soft face and a patient smile and spend 3 years simply waiting. Now, the 2 women he had used that theory on were both gone, and only one of them had bothered to take anything with her on the way out. And that one had taken, as it turned out, everything that actually mattered. By the time the desperation set in fully, by the time Dominic Ravelli, 3 months into an unraveling he still couldn't fully explain to the men whose loyalty he was rapidly losing, finally sat down across from a representative of a foreign lending syndicate, willing to extend the kind of emergency credit no domestic bank would touch anymore, willing to overlook the increasingly obvious instability of the Mercer organization in exchange for terms that would have made Anthony Mercer, in his prime, walk out of the room without a word. He had stopped asking himself how this had happened. He had started asking, instead, a far more dangerous question. How much further was he willing to fall before he found out exactly who was doing this to him, and what he was willing to do once he finally caught her? He signed the first loan agreement on a Tuesday afternoon, in an office 2 floors below the one that used to belong to his father-in-law, his signature shaking slightly on a contract he hadn't read closely enough, A contract structured through 3 layers of shell entities he didn't bother investigating. A contract that promised desperately needed capital at terms designed by a lender who, though Dominic Ravelli had absolutely no way of knowing it in that moment, was not foreign at all, was not, in any meaningful sense, even a stranger, was, in fact, the only person in the world who had ever fully understood exactly what kind of man he was and exactly how much rope to hand him before pulling it tight. The second loan came due faster than the first, and Dominic Ravelli sat in a borrowed conference room on the 40th floor of a building he didn't own, across from a man named Reyes who represented, according to the paperwork, a Panamanian lending consortium called Veritas Capital Partners. And he signed his name to another set of terms he understood, in the dim animal part of his brain that still registered danger he had no business signing. You're aware the collateral structure on this one ties directly to the Brooklyn terminal lease, Reyes said, sliding the pen across the table with 2 fingers, like he was handling something faintly unclean. He was a small, precise man, gray at the temples, with the kind of accent that came from somewhere expensive and stayed deliberately vague about where. I'm aware, Dominic said. He wasn't, not fully. He'd stopped reading the fine print 3 contracts ago, when reading the fine print had started feeling like reading his own obituary 1 clause at a time. Good. Reyes capped his own pen and slid the folder shut. Veritas appreciates a borrower who understands his position. Dominic signed it anyway. He had 400 employees on payroll across 3 states who didn't care whose name was on a Panamanian shell company, who only cared whether their checks cleared on Friday, and the checks had stopped clearing twice already that quarter. And a man only gets to explain that kind of failure to angry longshoremen so many times before they stop showing up to load the ships at all. He didn't know, signing it, that Veritas Capital Partners had been registered 4 months earlier by a Geneva law firm acting on instructions from a woman who had once sat across from him at a kitchen table signing whatever he handed her without reading a word. He didn't know that the collateral structure tying directly to the Brooklyn terminal lease had been engineered specifically so that a default, and there would be a default, there was always going to be a default, the terms were built to guarantee it, would transfer operational control of that terminal to Veritas within 90 days. He didn't know any of it, and that ignorance, more than any single decision he'd made since the funeral, was the thing slowly closing every door behind him. He found out 4 days later, not from Reyes, not from any lawyer, but from Frank Calabrese, who finally agreed to meet him, not at the restaurant in the Bronx this time, not anywhere public, but in the back office of a laundromat in Bensonhurst that Frank had owned, on paper, for 30 years, and had used for considerably less laundry than the name suggested. Frank was 71 years old, built like a refrigerator that had started to soften at the corners, with eyes that had watched 3 decades of younger men make exactly the kind of mistakes Dominic was making now. He didn't offer a handshake. He gestured at a folding chair across a card table and waited until Dominic sat before he spoke. You know who owns Veritas Capital, Frank said. It wasn't a question. They're a Panamanian consortium. Reyes handles the... I know what Reyes told you. Frank's voice was flat, almost bored, the particular boredom of a man who'd already done the work of being angry and had moved past it into something colder. I'm asking if you know who's actually behind the paper, because I do. It took me 3 weeks and a favor I'm going to be paying off for a year, but I know. Dominic felt something tighten low in his stomach, the specific tightening that comes right before a body braces for impact it can't yet see. Tell me. Margaret Voss, Frank said, Geneva attorney, runs a boutique firm that does exactly one kind of work, protecting assets for people who need them, protected from people exactly like you. She set up Veritas. She set up at least 6 other shells I found, all of them holding paper on different pieces of what used to be Anthony Mercer's organization, insurance underwriting on your cargo fleet, the customs bond on the Long Beach operation, the line of credit that bank in Zurich pulled on you back in the fall. Frank leaned forward, and the card table creaked under the shift of his weight. Every single piece of bad luck you've had this year, Dominic, it's got the same lawyer's fingerprints on it. And Margaret Voss doesn't take freelance clients. She's had exactly 1 client of significance for the last 15 years. Anthony, Dominic said, his voice coming out smaller than he wanted it to. Anthony's dead. Frank's eyes didn't move off his face. Who inherited Anthony's accounts, Dominic? The room went very quiet. Somewhere behind the wall, a dryer thumped through its cycle, an absurd, mundane sound to be standing inside of, while the floor dropped out from under a man's entire understanding of the last year of his life. "Vivienne," Dominic said. "Vivienne," Frank agreed. "Every piece of this, the frozen accounts, the lost shipping contracts, the insurance lapses, the loan you just signed that's going to hand her the Brooklyn terminal on a silver platter the day you miss a payment, which you will. Because the terms were built so you would... all of it. Your wife has been running you into the ground for the better part of a year, and you've been so busy drowning you never once stopped to ask who built the water." Dominic sat very still. He was aware distantly of his own heartbeat, fast and shallow, his palms damp against the cheap folding table. "How long have you known?" "Long enough to wonder why I'm the only one on the commission willing to say it to your face instead of behind your back." Frank sat back, and something in his expression shifted. Not warmer exactly, but more direct. The look of a man delivering a verdict he'd already decided was final. "I'm not here out of loyalty to you, Dominic. I voted for you because I thought you were hungry enough to hold things together. I was wrong about what kind of hungry you were. You were hungry for a seat. She's hungry for the whole table. There's a difference, and it's the difference between you walking out of this with something left and you walking out of this with nothing at all. What do you want, Frank?" "I want to know what you're going to do about it," Frank said. "Because right now, from where the commission's sitting, it looks like you let a woman you underestimated for 3 years quietly dismantle an empire you were supposed to be protecting. That's not a good look for a man trying to hold a seat at that table. Other men are starting to wonder if maybe the seat should go to somebody who didn't get outplayed by his own wife." Dominic left the laundromat without saying goodbye, walked 4 blocks in the cold without registering the cold, and sat in his car outside a closed pharmacy for almost 20 minutes before he could make his hands steady enough to drive. The fury, when it finally arrived, didn't come as heat. It came as something closer to vertigo, the specific, sick disorientation of a man realizing that every floor he'd been standing on for the last year had been built by the person he'd spent 3 years calling a shield, a convenience, a means to an end. He thought about the kitchen table, the wedding ring, the 4 sentences and handwriting he'd once thought looked delicate. He thought about every contract he'd signed without reading, every account he'd assumed was simply slow to process, every capo who'd grown distant, and every loan that had felt, in the moment, like a lifeline instead of a leash being measured for his throat. He thought about the study, the rain, the conversation with Sal that had started all of it, and a thought surfaced that he hadn't let himself examine until now. She had been standing in that hallway. He didn't know it for certain. He'd never had proof, never had a reason to suspect, but sitting in that cold car, replaying her behavior in the weeks after that night, the strange new stillness in her eyes at breakfast, the careful, deliberate quality of a performance he'd mistaken for grief recovering into normalcy, he understood, with total and devastating certainty, that she had heard every word. She had heard him call her a shield, heard him laugh about 3 years of telling a woman the size of a small house that she was beautiful, heard him say he didn't lie awake counting the ways he got lucky, and she had walked back up the stairs and washed her face and come down to breakfast the next morning and let him keep talking about shipment delays like nothing in the world had changed, while inside her something had already finished dying and something else had already started, with terrible patience, to plan. He drove to the house. Their house, though the word felt increasingly theoretical with every week that passed. He poured a drink he didn't taste and sat in the study and stared at the framed photograph of Anthony Mercer young and lean on a Brooklyn dock. And for the first time since the funeral, he let himself say her name out loud, alone, to an empty room. Vivienne. It came out strange. Half curse, half something he didn't have a better word for than respect, ugly and unwilling and entirely against his will. His phone rang at 11 that night. He almost didn't answer it. He'd stopped answering most calls by then, too tired of bad news to keep absorbing it in real time. But the number was unfamiliar, international, and something in his gut told him to pick it up. "Mr. Ravelli." A woman's voice, accented, precise, entirely unfamiliar and somehow exactly what he'd expected. "My name is Margit Voss. I believe Mr. Calabrese has already given you a partial accounting of our relationship." Dominic's hand tightened around the glass hard enough that he felt the rim bite into his palm. Where is she? That information is not something I'm authorized to share. There was no malice in the voice, no satisfaction, just the flat, professional indifference of a woman delivering facts she'd delivered to other men in other ruined positions before. I'm calling as a courtesy, Mr. Ravelli, because my client felt you deserved to hear this directly rather than discover it through further collapse of your remaining holdings. The Brooklyn terminal lease will transfer in 90 days per the terms you signed with Veritas Capital. The loan from the second consortium, the one you signed 11 days ago, carries a similar structure. I would advise you, going forward, to read documents more carefully before signing them, though I recognize the advice arrives somewhat late to be useful. Ba misaki yatskimbas. Tell her. Dominic stopped. He didn't know what he wanted to say. Tell her what? That he was sorry? That he understood now, too late, exactly what kind of woman he'd spent 3 years failing to see? That some ugly, unfamiliar part of him, underneath the fury, had started to feel something close to awe at the scope of what she'd built in total silence while he laughed about her at dinner parties? None of it would matter. None of it would change the math sitting in front of him. Tell her I'll find her, he said instead, and his voice came out lower and colder than he intended. The voice of a man discovering in real time exactly how far he was willing to go now that everything soft in him had been burned away by humiliation. Tell her this isn't over just because she's hiding behind a lake in Switzerland. There was a brief silence on the line, and when Margit Voss spoke again, her voice had not changed at all, had not acquired even the faintest edge of alarm, which somehow frightened him more than if it had. I'll relay the message, Mr. Ravelli, though I should mention, for your own benefit, that my client has never once described herself as hiding. A pause, deliberate, surgical. Good evening. The line went dead. Dominic sat in the dark study holding a phone that had just delivered the single worst night of his adult life, and somewhere underneath the fury building in his chest like a held breath finally about to break, a new thought arrived, quieter than the rage but considerably more dangerous for how calmly it settled into him. If she could not be reached through banks, through lawyers, through the institutions she'd spent a year turning into weapons against him, then he would simply have to stop playing the game on her terms. He would have to find a way to make this personal again. Physical. The kind of conflict that money and lawyers and Swiss attorneys couldn't fully insulate a person from, no matter how many shell companies stood between them. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the study until the windows went gray with dawn, turning over every fragment of information he had, every name Frank had given him, every detail Margit Voss's call had inadvertently confirmed, and somewhere around 5 in the morning, sober for the first time in weeks and shaking from exhaustion rather than fear, Dominic Ravelli stopped being a man trying to salvage an inheritance. He started becoming something considerably more desperate and considerably more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose, staring down the wreckage of everything he'd built his identity on, and beginning, with the cold, patient fury of someone finally willing to burn down whatever remained, rather than keep losing it one quiet liquidation at a time, to plan exactly how he intended to drag Vivian Mercer back into a room where the only currency that still belonged to him, violence, fear, the threat of his own ruin made physical, could finally even the score she thought she'd already won. She came back to New York on a Thursday, and she didn't try to hide it. That was the part Marcus Boone argued with her about for almost an hour in the back of the car from the airport, his hands tight on the wheel, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds out of 15 years of trained habit. You don't need to be here, he said. Whatever you need to finalize, Margit can finalize it from Geneva. You being on the ground, in this city, where he's got eyes everywhere, he's got money left to pay for them. He needs to see my face, Vivian said. She was looking out the window at a skyline she'd grown up under and hadn't seen in 11 months, and her voice didn't carry the tremor Marcus had clearly expected to find. He needs to understand this wasn't an accident, wasn't bad luck, wasn't a bank error, wasn't some abstract financial weather system that happened to land on him. It was me, every piece of it, and he doesn't get to lose his entire life to a woman he never has to look in the eye. That's not strategy, Viv. That's a target on your back. It's both, she said, and that was the end of the conversation. The plan had been precise. Built over 6 weeks with Margit's lawyers and 2 men Marcus trusted absolutely. Men whose names Vivian had never asked for and didn't intend to. The final piece? The evidence packet documenting 11 years of laundering routes, falsified shipping manifests, 2 off-the-books killings Dominic had personally ordered during his rise through the organization, and the financial fraud he'd committed against the commission itself by representing assets as his that had never, not for one day of his tenure, actually belonged to him. That packet existed in triplicate, in 3 jurisdictions, set to release automatically to federal investigators and to the full commission simultaneously if anything happened to Vivian, to Marcus, or to Margit. She hadn't built a trap. She'd built an inevitability. Dominic Ravelli's downfall no longer required her continued presence in the world to occur. It only required patience and time, and the simple administrative fact of dates on a calendar. She came back anyway, because some debts, she'd decided somewhere over the Atlantic, needed to be collected in person. Word reached Dominic within 6 hours. It always did, in that city, among that world. Somebody's cousin worked at the airport. Somebody's brother drove a car service. The information economy of organized crime ran faster than any bank wire Dominic had ever waited on. And by the time the sun went down, he was standing in what remained of his office with Sal and 2 men he still barely trusted, staring at a phone screen showing a grainy photograph of his wife walking through customs at JFK in a charcoal coat, sunglasses pushed up into her hair, looking nothing like the woman who'd once waited up for him with a glass of water sweating in her hand. "She's here," Sal said, unnecessarily, because Dominic was already moving, already pulling his jacket off the back of the chair, already running through a calculation that had nothing left in it resembling restraint. "Get Carmine. Get Tony. Get every man still answering your calls and tell them to meet at the Red Hook warehouse in 2 hours." Dominic's voice had gone somewhere flat and final, the voice of a man who'd spent 3 months grinding down to something with no more give left in it. "I'm done waiting for lawyers and bank statements to fix this. She wants to show her face in my city. She's going to do it on my terms. Dom." Sal's voice carried a warning he didn't often risk voicing out loud. "Think about what you're doing. If something happens to her, nothing's going to happen to her that she didn't already do to herself," Dominic said. "I'm going to sit her down and she's going to give me back what's mine, or she's going to explain to me face to face exactly what kind of woman spends a year destroying a man and calls it justice." He didn't say what would happen if she refused. He didn't let himself think that far ahead, because some part of him, buried under the fury, under the humiliation, under 3 months of watching everything he'd built collapse one phone call at a time, still flinched away from the shape of that thought. The warehouse at Red Hook had belonged to the Mercer organization for 20 years, a long, low building on the water with rust climbing the corrugated walls and a row of broken skylights that threw cold gray light onto a concrete floor stained dark in patches that predated anyone currently standing on it. Dominic had chosen it deliberately, neutral enough that it wouldn't immediately implicate him if anything went wrong, isolated enough that no one would hear whatever happened inside, and familiar enough that he could walk it blind. Every exit, every blind corner, every place a man could hide a gun within reach. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, because the lie had been constructed with exactly this moment in mind, was that the information bringing him here had not been intelligence he'd gathered. It had been intelligence he'd been given. Vivian had let the rumor reach him, a careful, deniable whisper through a cousin of a driver who owed Marcus a favor. "She's staying at a safe house near the warehouse district. She's meeting someone there tonight. She's vulnerable. She's alone." Every word of it false, except the location, and the location only true because Vivian herself had chosen it, had walked it twice in the preceding week with 2 men whose names she didn't ask for, had stood in the center of that cold concrete floor and felt, for the first time in 11 months, something that wasn't patience, something closer to readiness. Dominic arrived a few minutes past midnight with 6 men, more firepower than the situation called for if all he intended was a conversation, and that imbalance told its own story to anyone paying close enough attention. He moved through the front entrance with his jacket open, his breath visible in the cold air rolling off the water, his eyes scanning the dim interior of the warehouse, with the particular hyper-awareness of a man who'd spent 3 months losing every fight he couldn't see coming and had decided finally that he would rather lose a fight he could see than keep losing ones he couldn't. "Vivian." His voice cracked off the metal walls, came back at him distorted, multiplied. "I know you're here. I know this whole thing. Switzerland, the lawyers, the loans. I know it's you. I'm done playing games through banks. You want to take what's mine, you do it to my face." Nothing answered him but the slow drip of water somewhere in the dark, and the soft scrape of his men's boots fanning out behind him, weapons drawn now, eyes adjusting to shadows that seemed, the longer they stood in them, to hold more depth than 6 men with flashlights could account for. "Carmine, check the east side," Dominic said, low. "Tony, with me. Everybody stays sharp." They moved deeper into the warehouse, past stacked pallets gone gray with dust, past a forklift that hadn't run in a decade. The cold coming up through the concrete and into Dominic's chest until his breath came ragged, half from exertion and half from something closer to the dread he wouldn't name. His heart was slamming against his ribs hard enough that he could feel it in his throat, in the thin sheen of sweat breaking out under his collar despite the cold, every nerve in his body screaming the particular alarm of a predator realizing too late that the geometry of the room had shifted under him. The lights came on all at once, not the warehouse's old fluorescents, flickering and dim. These were portable floods, professional grade, mounted on tripods. Dominic hadn't seen in the dark and now understood, with a sick lurch in his stomach, had been positioned with surgical precision around the warehouse's open center. The sudden white glare blinded him for a full second, and in that second he heard the unmistakable sound of multiple safeties clicking off in near-perfect unison, a sound that traveled through the cold air like something physical. When his eyes adjusted, he was standing in the center of a kill box, 6 trained operators positioned in a loose perimeter around his crew. Weapons raised, faces calm in the particular way of men who did this work often enough that adrenaline had long since stopped being a novelty. His own men had frozen, guns half raised, eyes darting between targets they had no clean angle on, every one of them doing the same fast, grim math Dominic was doing. That they were outnumbered, outpositioned, and had walked into this room believing they held every advantage. And in the middle of it, standing on an old wooden crate that put her at eye level with the men surrounding her, was Vivian. She wasn't wearing the charcoal coat from the airport photo. She'd changed into something simpler, dark, practical, clothes built for a confrontation rather than an arrival. And she stood with her hands loose at her sides, utterly unhurried, looking down at the husband she hadn't seen in 11 months, with an expression that contained no fear at all, only a vast, terrible patience that had clearly been waiting for exactly this moment. "Hello, Dominic." His mouth had gone dry. He could hear his own pulse in his ears, a frantic drumming that made the floodlights seem to pulse in time with it. "You set me up?" "You set yourself up," she said. "I just told you where to find the trap and waited to see if your pride would walk you into it. It did. It always does with men like you. You've never once in your life been able to resist the idea that you're the one in control of a room." "Call them off," Dominic said, and his voice cracked, just slightly, the first real crack she'd heard in it in 3 years of marriage. "Call them off and we talk. Just us. You and me." "We are talking," Vivian said. "This is the conversation. You wanted me to come back to your city and explain myself to your face. Here I am." She stepped down off the crate, slow, deliberate, and walked toward him with the floodlights throwing her shadow long and sharp across the concrete, and despite 6 trained guns at his back and the absolute certainty that he had lost, Dominic found himself unable to look away from her face, searching it for some trace of the woman who used to leave the porch light on for him, and finding, instead, someone he had never actually met. "You want to know what I figured out?" she said, stopping 3 feet from him, close enough that he could see the exhaustion under her eyes. The particular kind that comes from building something enormous out of grief and not sleeping properly in almost a year. "I figured out that you never once, in 3 years, asked me a single question about myself that you actually wanted the answer to. You asked me things to manage me, to keep me calm, to keep me grateful. You built a whole marriage out of management, Dominic, and you were so good at it you convinced yourself it was love right up until the night you told Sal exactly what it really was. You were listening." His voice had dropped to something raw, almost a whisper, the sound of a man finally saying out loud the thing he'd been circling for 3 months. "That whole time, you knew, and you let me keep believing. I let you keep believing because you'd spent 3 years teaching me that my silence was useful to you," Vivian said. "I just decided to make it useful to me instead. You called me a shield. Do you know what a shield does, Dominic, when the person holding it finally turns it around?" He didn't answer. His jaw worked, no sound coming out. and behind him one of his men shifted his weight, the small sound of a boot scraping concrete loud as a gunshot in the heavy silence. "It stops protecting you," she said. "It starts protecting everything you spent your whole life trying to take." "You think this ends it?" His voice found something harder, something closer to the man who'd once told a roomful of capos he'd earned his seat through 3 years of strategic loyalty. "You think you walk out of here and it's over. I built relationships in this organization you can't liquidate with a bank transfer, Vivian. I've got men who—" "Frank Calabrese already told the commission everything," Vivian said, and watched the words land on him like a physical blow, watched his face go through 3 distinct stages of disbelief before settling into something that looked almost like grief. About Veritas, about the loans, about a leader who got so busy drowning he never noticed who built the water, in his own words, I believe. "The commission isn't deciding whether to back you anymore, Dominic. They're deciding how to distance themselves from you before what's coming reaches their own doorsteps." "What's coming?" His voice had gone very quiet. Vivian reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and withdrew a slim black drive, holding it up between 2 fingers in the white glare of the floodlights, letting him see it, letting the shape of what it represented settle into him before she spoke again. "Everything," she said. 11 years of it? The laundering routes through the Long Beach terminal, the falsified manifests on 3 shipments the federal government has been quietly building a case around for longer than you'd like to know. The 2 men who disappeared in 2019 on your direct order, which I have documented in considerably more detail than you'd be comfortable with." She watched him absorb each item, watched the color drain progressively out of his face. "I have spent 11 months building a case against you that doesn't require a single bullet to end you, Dominic. It only requires me deciding what time to send it, and to whom." The warehouse had gone utterly silent, except for the distant slap of water against the pilings outside. And somewhere in that silence, Dominic Ravelli understood, with the particular vertigo of a man watching his own execution arrive in slow motion, that every gun pointed at him in that room was, in the end, the least dangerous thing standing in front of him. Vivian. Her name came out of him broken, stripped of every register he'd ever used to manage her, manage anyone. Just a man, finally, standing in the wreckage of his own arrogance with nothing left to negotiate with. "Don't do this." "I already did it," she said quietly. 11 months ago. Tonight, I'm just letting you watch." His hand moved, not toward a weapon, not exactly, more an instinct than a decision, the last desperate reflex of a cornered animal. And the air in the warehouse went tight and electric, 6 fingers tensing against 6 triggers in perfect unison. And Vivian did not flinch, did not step back, stood perfectly still 3 feet from a man whose next half-second of movement was about to decide whether this ended in surrender or in something the floodlights and the cold water outside would have to absorb in silence. His hand stopped an inch from his jacket. It wasn't courage that stopped it. Vivian would think about that later, turning the moment over the way she'd once turned over 4 sentences on a kitchen table, and she'd understand that it had never been courage with Dominic. Not really, not even now. It was math. The same cold, instinctive math that had carried him up through her father's organization for 15 years. The same calculation that told a man exactly how many seconds he had left before a room decided his fate for him. He looked at the 6 raised weapons, at the steady hands behind them, at the woman standing close enough to touch with an expression that held no fear in it at all, and the animal part of his brain that had kept him alive through things considerably worse than this finally overruled the wounded, furious part demanding he do something, anything, rather than stand there and be unmade. His hand dropped to his side, slowly, open. "Tony, Carmine." His voice came out hoarse, scraped raw. "Stand down, all of you. Lower the guns." It took a few seconds for his men to obey, the particular hesitation of soldiers waiting for the order to mean what it said. And then, one by one, weapons lowered toward the concrete, and the warehouse exhaled, the tension in the air loosening just enough that Vivian could hear, again, the slow drip of water somewhere behind her, and the distant hush of the river against the pilings. "Smart," she said quietly. "First smart thing you've done since the funeral." Dominic stood with his arms loose at his sides, his chest rising and falling too fast, sweat cutting clean lines through the grime on his face, despite the cold rolling off the water outside. He looked, in that light, considerably older than the man who'd once asked her to dance at her cousin's wedding. The jaw still sharp, but the eyes had gone hollow in a way that no amount of expensive tailoring could disguise. "What do you want?" he said. "Tell me what you want and I'll do it. You want the rest of it signed over? Fine. You want me gone? Out of the city? Out of the business? Fine. Whatever this is, whatever you need for me to stop, just say it." "I don't need anything from you, Dominic." Vivian's voice was even, almost gentle, which was somehow worse than if she'd screamed. "That's the part you still haven't understood. 3 years. I needed things from you. Your approval, your attention. Some sign that the man I married was real and not a performance you were running on a woman you thought was too soft to ever check the math. I don't need anything from you anymore. I have everything I need. I'm just here to watch you understand that. Then why come back at all?" Something cracked in his voice, raw and unguarded, closer to the truth than anything he'd said since she'd stepped down off that crate. "If you don't need anything, if you already won, why walk into a warehouse with 6 guns just to look me in the eye?" It was, Vivian realized, the only honest question he'd asked her in years, and she gave him the only honest answer she had. "Bus, because the woman who married you needed to see, with her own eyes, that she's gone," she said. "Not metaphorically. Not as some line in a story I tell myself to feel better. I needed to stand in front of you, in the cold, in a warehouse that used to belong to my father, and feel absolutely nothing where 3 years of hope used to live. I needed to know that part of me actually died the night I heard you in that study, instead of just hoping it did." She paused, and something in her face, for just a moment, showed the cost of all of it. 11 months of 16-hour days and cold apartments and grief she'd had to schedule into 11-minute increments so it wouldn't slow her down. "Now I know, and I can leave." "Leave to where?" Dominic said, and there was something almost desperate in it now, the particular desperation of a man watching the only relationship that had ever truly seen him, however cruelly, however incompletely, walk out of reach for the last time. "You're just going to disappear again? Take everything and vanish back to Switzerland and let me sit here with nothing?" "You won't have nothing," Vivian said. "You'll have exactly what you earned. The commission already knows what you did. Frank Calabrese made sure of that days ago. The Brooklyn terminal transfers to a holding company tomorrow morning, regardless of anything that happens here tonight. The federal case that's been building against the organization for 3 years, the one you apparently never bothered to ask Sal about in any real detail, is going to come looking for the man whose name is on the falsified manifests, and that man is you, not me, because I made sure my name was never on a single document that mattered." She let that settle, watched it land. "I'm not taking anything from you tonight that you didn't already lose the moment you decided I was too stupid to notice what you were building behind my back." "And the drive," he said, nodding toward her closed fist, the slim black rectangle that held 11 years of his worst decisions compressed into a few gigabytes of data. "What happens to that?" This was the moment Vivian had rehearsed more than any other, lying awake in the Geneva apartment, turning over exactly what kind of woman she wanted to be once this was finally over. Marcus had assumed she'd hand it to the federal investigators herself, walk it personally into an FBI field office, and watch the cuffs go on. Margaret had assumed she'd use it as leverage, a permanent threat held over Dominic's head to guarantee his silence and his distance for the rest of his life. Both of them had built their assumptions on the same theory, that a woman who had endured what Vivian endured would want, somewhere underneath the strategy, a moment of violence to call closure. She had thought for a while that they were right. "It already went out," she said, 2 hours ago. "Triplicate copies to the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force, to the SEC given the financial fraud angle, and to every member of the commission who hasn't already abandoned you. I didn't come here to deliver an ultimatum, Dominic. The ultimatum already happened. I came here to watch you find out." Something in his face collapsed at that. Not dramatically, not with the kind of explosive grief that belonged in a different kind of man, but quietly, the slow, visible deflation of someone realizing that even this confrontation, the one piece of the evening he'd actually controlled by choosing the location and calling the men, had been allowed to happen, stage-managed by a woman who had already finished the war before he'd realized the first shot had been fired. "You could have just let me drown quietly," he said. "Why all of this? Why the warehouse, the guns, the speech? Why not just let the case build itself and disappear forever, like you wanted before? Vivian considered the question honestly, the cold air burning faintly in her chest, the floodlights throwing both their shadows long and distorted against the rusted walls. Because my father spent his whole life building an empire, and the last 6 months of it apologizing to me for handing it to a man who saw me as furniture, she said. And I spent 3 years letting you believe that furniture doesn't notice when it's being insulted in the next room. I needed you to know, specifically, precisely, looking at my face and not a bank statement, that the woman you mocked is the one who took it all back. Not a system, not lawyers, me. Her voice didn't rise, didn't shake. The absolute steadiness of someone who had said this exact sentence to herself in a mirror more times than she'd admit. That's not revenge, Dominic. Revenge would have been a bullet, and I have 6 people in this room right now who'd have put one in you the second you reached for that jacket. This is something else. This is just the truth, finally, standing close enough that you can't pretend not to hear it. He looked at her for a long moment, and something passed behind his eyes that might, in another life, in a different version of this man, have grown into something like genuine remorse. Vivian watched for it with clinical interest rather than hope. She had given up hoping for that particular transformation somewhere over the Atlantic 11 months earlier. And what she saw instead was something more honest, the slow, grinding arrival of a man finally understanding the size of what he'd thrown away. Not because he'd loved her, but because he'd never once bothered to find out what loving her might have actually cost him to gain. I'm not going to apologize, he said finally, and there was something almost like dignity in it. The last scrap of a man refusing to perform contrition he didn't fully feel just to soften a landing that was happening regardless. Not because I don't know what I did. I know exactly what I did. I'm not going to stand here and perform sorry for an audience that's already decided the verdict, because you'd see through it in half a second, and we both know it. That's the first true thing you've said to me in 3 years, Vivian said. And for the briefest moment, something almost like respect moved between them. Not forgiveness, nothing close to forgiveness, but the particular acknowledgement 2 people sometimes manage at the very end of a war, when the only thing left to negotiate is how honestly they're willing to lose. Walk away, she said. That's all that's left for you to do tonight. Walk out of this warehouse, go home to whatever's left of the house, and wait for what's coming, because it's coming whether you spend the time fighting it or not. I'm not going to stop you from leaving the city if that's what you decide. I'm not going to chase you. I'm done chasing anything that has your name on it. He stood there for a long moment, the floodlights washing the color out of his face, his men watching him with the particular wariness of soldiers no longer certain whose orders they were actually following. Then, without another word, without the speech he might once have given, without the performance that had defined every room he'd ever walked into, Dominic Ravelli turned and walked out of the warehouse into the cold dark beyond the floodlights, his footsteps slow and unsteady against the concrete, a man leaving not because he'd been forgiven, but because there was, finally, genuinely, nothing left in that building for him to fight for. His men followed him out in loose, uncertain formation, and within a few minutes the warehouse had emptied of everyone except Vivian, Marcus, and the 6 operators who began methodically and without comment packing away the floodlights and the tripods as though the entire confrontation had been nothing more than a job finished on schedule. Marcus came to stand beside her as the last light folded down into its case, throwing the warehouse back into the gray, ordinary dark it had occupied before any of this began. "You okay?" he asked. Vivian considered the question with the same honesty she'd given Dominic's last one. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think I will be. Eventually. I think tonight was the last night I needed to spend any part of myself on him at all. Your father would be proud of you," Marcus said. "Not for the warehouse, for the part where you didn't let them kill him when he reached for that jacket." "I know." She watched the last operator zip the equipment case shut, the small mechanical sound of it strangely final in the cavernous quiet. "I almost didn't stop them. For about half a second, watching his hand move, I thought about just letting it happen, letting it end the way every part of me that used to love him wanted it to end." She exhaled, long and slow, watching her breath fog faintly in the cold air. "Then I thought about what kind of woman I'd have to become to live with that choice for the rest of my life. and I decided I'd already spent enough of myself becoming someone for his benefit. I wasn't going to spend any more of it becoming someone for his punishment. The federal case moved with the particular grinding inevitability of institutions finally given everything they need to act decisively. Within 6 weeks, Dominic Ravelli was indicted on racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy charges that drew directly on the documentation Vivian had spent 11 months compiling, evidence so thorough and so meticulously cross-referenced that the prosecuting attorney would later describe it, in a closed-door briefing nobody outside the task force ever heard, as the most complete financial case against an organized crime figure her office had built in over a decade. The commission, faced with a federal spotlight none of them wanted pointed anywhere near their own businesses, distanced themselves from him with the swift, bloodless efficiency of men who had spent their lives surviving exactly this kind of exposure by abandoning whoever was standing closest to it. Selena Marchetti was photographed once more, 3 months later, at an event in Monaco on the arm of the Saudi shipping magnate, and if she ever spared a thought for the man who'd once paraded her through New York's gallery openings while his wife sat home signing documents she didn't understand, the tabloids never reported it, and Vivian, reading the item on a tablet in a sunlit kitchen 6,000 miles from where any of it had started, found she genuinely did not care enough to wonder. Dominic took a plea eventually, reducing a sentence that could have run decades into something closer to 12 years with the possibility of parole, a deal his lawyers framed as a victory, and that Frank Calabrese, hearing about it secondhand from a contact who still owed him a favor, reportedly called the only smart decision the man had made since the day Anthony Mercer's casket went into the ground. Vivian did not attend the sentencing. She had Margit confirm the outcome by email, read it once, standing in the same Geneva office where she'd first seen the full scope of her father's hidden fortune spread across a glass conference table, and closed the laptop without ceremony, the way a person closes a door on a room they've finally finished cleaning out. The Mercer organization did not survive in the form her father had built it, and Vivian had never intended that it would. Over the following year, working with Margit and a small team of lawyers and financial advisors she'd handpicked for their willingness to operate in daylight rather than shadow, she began the long, deliberate process of transforming what remained: the shipping infrastructure, the port relationships, the genuine, profitable logistics business buried underneath decades of laundering and violence, into something legitimate. Mercer Global Logistics filed its incorporation papers 14 months after the warehouse, headquartered not in New York, but in a converted dockside building in Rotterdam, far enough from every old association that the name carried weight without carrying history, close enough to the original shipping lanes her father had built his life around that the continuity felt, to Vivian, less like erasure and more like inheritance properly understood. She kept Marcus on as head of security for the new company, a role he took with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd spent 15 years protecting a family and had finally watched the daughter of that family build something worth protecting on its own merit, rather than its capacity for violence. She kept 3 of her father's old shipping contacts, men who'd respected Anthony Mercer enough to extend Vivian the same respect once they understood exactly what she'd survived and exactly what she'd built afterward. She did not keep anyone who had ever, in any context, referred to her in the manner Dominic once had in a rain-soaked study. And there were more of those people than she'd expected to discover, scattered through the organization like splinters she hadn't known were lodged under her skin until she finally went looking for them. There was a night, almost 2 years after the warehouse, when Vivian stood on the balcony of an apartment overlooking the Rotterdam harbor, watching the lights of cargo vessels move slow and patient across dark water, container ships carrying goods under a company name that belonged entirely to her, built on terms she'd written herself. And she found herself thinking, without warning, of the 11 minutes she'd allowed herself to cry behind a bedroom door 3 years earlier, the small brass clock ticking down a grief she'd refused to let consume more time than that. She did not feel triumphant exactly. Triumph implied an opponent worth measuring herself against, and somewhere in the 2 years since the warehouse, Dominic Ravelli had simply stopped occupying that kind of space in her understanding of herself. He was a man in a federal facility serving a sentence he'd earned through choices that had nothing to do with her, a chapter she'd closed with the same finality she'd once closed a laptop in a Geneva office, and the woman standing on that balcony, watching ships move toward harbors under names she'd chosen, understood that the actual victory had never been his downfall at all. The victory was simpler than that, and considerably harder won. It was the fact that she had built something real out of the wreckage of something false, and built it without becoming, in the process, the kind of person who needed anyone's ruin to feel whole. She had wanted, for 1/2 second in a cold warehouse with a man's hand frozen an inch from a weapon, to let violence finish what patience had started. She hadn't. That single choice, more than any account she'd frozen, or any contract she'd liquidated, or any evidence packet she'd compiled across 11 sleepless months, was the thing she returned to on quiet nights, as proof that whatever Dominic Ravelli had taken from her in that hallway 3 years ago, he had never managed to take the only thing that actually mattered. She was no longer the woman who needed to be told she was loved, to believe she deserved to take up space in the world. She had built a fleet, a company, a life with her own name on the paperwork instead of a husband's, and she had done it the slow way, the patient way, the way her father had finally, in his last months, understood she'd always been capable of, even when neither of them had known to call it by its right name. The ships moved on across the dark water, steady and unhurried, carrying their cargo toward harbors that didn't care whose hands had built the fortune behind them, only that the work had been done well, and Vivian Mercer stood watching them with the particular stillness of a woman who had finally, fully, stopped waiting for anyone's permission to become exactly who she already was.